In April 2011, the Callaway family, Allan, Elena, and their two children, Matthew and Sophie, were found dead in their suburban Hawthorne, Illinois home. Initially believed to be a tragic accident, authorities quickly determined that the deaths were the result of a meticulously planned murder-suicide. Allan Callaway, a respected attorney, had documented his mental unraveling in journals found at the scene. Investigators pieced together a timeline beginning in 2010, when Allan became suspicious of changes in his wife's behavior. The discovery of her affair in late 2010 marked the breaking point in what appeared to be an otherwise idyllic family life, setting the stage for an unthinkable tragedy on the morning of April 16, 2011. The quiet suburb of Hawthorne, Illinois began its day like any other. The early hours brought the usual sights and sounds, birds chirping, the hum of distant lawn mowers, and neighbors beginning their routines. However, something was amiss on LW Drive, where the Callaway family's home stood, a neatly maintained two-story house that epitomized suburban stability at 7-A. McCarroll Jenkins, a longtime neighbor of the Callaways, noticed several unusual details. 2 bottles of milk delivered by the milkman early that morning remained untouched on the front porch nearby. 2 neatly folded newspapers were still lying at the edge of the driveway, untouched since delivery. This stood out immediately. Allan Callaway, a well-known attorney and creature of habit, was typically up before 6 a.m. to retrieve the papers, and the sight of them still there set off alarm bells for Carol. At first she tried to dismiss her concern, reasoning that perhaps the family was running late or had left early for an outing. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong by 7:30 a.m. Carol walked across the street to check on the family. She rang the doorbell twice and waited. The chime echoed inside the house, but no one came to the door. She knocked firmly and even called out, but the silence from within was unsettling. Knowing the cows' routine and their fastidious nature, Carol decided to call the police by 7:45. She contacted local authorities, explaining the situation, the untouched milk and papers, and the lack of response at the door. "It just doesn't feel right." She told the dispatcher the concern wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to warrant a welfare check. 2 officers arrived on the scene at approximately 8:05 a.m. They observed the same details Carol had reported: the untouched milk, the newspapers, and the uncharacteristic stillness of the home. The house appeared locked and secure, with curtains drawn over the windows. The officers knocked loudly and announced themselves, but no response came from inside. After assessing the situation, they decided to force entry. The officers breached the front door and stepped cautiously into the foyer. The interior of the home was meticulously clean, but the silence was heavy and unnatural. There were no signs of disturbance or forced entry, no indication of a burglary or struggle. As they moved further into the house, the faint metallic scent in the air hinted at what they were about to uncover. What they found inside the Callaway home would leave an indelible mark on the quiet community of Hawthorne. The air inside the house felt heavy, still almost suffocating. The faint scent of something metallic lingered, barely noticeable but unsettling as they moved. Deeper into the home, their footsteps echoed in the pristine dining room, where the first and most horrifying discovery was made. Allan, Elena, Matthew, and Sophie were seated around the table. As if frozen in time, the sight was haunting: plates of untouched food before them, glasses still half full. The family eerily positioned like they were mid-dinner, their lifeless bodies slumped in their chairs, their faces pale and peaceful, except for the unnatural stillness of death. Nearby, an empty bottle of wine and a small bowl of what looked like sugar sat on the counter. Forensics would later confirm the presence of a lethal poison slipped into the wine they had shared. It was a chilling scene of calculated destruction, but it wasn't the end of the nightmare. As officers searched the rest of the house, the sense of unease deepened. They found Allan in his study, seated in his large leather chair, Unlike the others, his death was not peaceful. A single gunshot wound to the head told the story. His right-hand hand still loosely gripped the firearm, a small pool of blood drying on the carpet below him. The desk before him was unusually bare, save for a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. It was the first of many notes they would find, but this one carried the most immediate weight. The note was chilling in its simplicity. Allan had written it methodically his. Handwriting precise. It wasn't an apology, but rather a statement, a cryptic explanation that hinted at betrayal, pain, and a decision he felt was inevitable. The full truth would take days to unravel, but even at this early stage the weight of Allan's words made it clear that this was not a random act of violence. It was a tragedy born from within the family. By April 18, 2011, the investigation had moved forward with grim determination. The letters and journal entries found in Allan's study provided a devastating window into his mental state. He had documented everything, and painstaking detail the suspicions that had gwed him, the betrayal that had consumed him, and the decision he had made to preserve what was left of his family's dignity. Each entry was a step deeper into his unraveling, revealing a man who felt trapped, broken, and betrayed beyond repair. The letters painted a picture of a marriage that, while outwardly perfect, had been crumbling for years. Allan wrote of Elena's distance, her growing disinterest in their shared life, and the nights he had spent alone wondering where she was and who she was with when he discovered her affair with Ryan Miller. The words in his journal grew darker, sharper. "There is no coming back from this." One entry read, "She destroyed the foundation we built, and now I must decide how to salvage the pieces for the investigators." It was an emotionally grueling case. As they pieced together Allan's descent, they couldn't help but feel the weight of his despair. But there was still more to uncover. On April 22, 2011, surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera revealed a critical moment in the days leading up to the tragedy, the video time stamped at 8:14 p. So on April 12th, showed Allan and Elena standing on their front porch. The footage had no sound, but their body language spoke volumes. Allan's posture was rigid, his gestures sharp and deliberate. Elena, by contrast, seemed defensive, her arms crossed, tightly against her chest at one point. She turned away, attempting to go inside, but Allan blocked her path, leaning in close, as if making a final point. The argument lasted only minutes, but it was enough to confirm that the tension in the household had reached a boiling point. This confrontation, investigators believed, was the turning point. Whatever Allan had discovered or confronted Elena about on that evening sealed the family's fate. The idyllic life of the Callaways, so carefully curated and admired by those around them, was nothing more than a fragile shell. And in the days that followed, that shell would shatter entirely. The story of the Callaway family, now dissected through the lens of tragedy, began to take on a life of its own. To those who had known them, the revelations were almost impossible to reconcile with the family. They thought they understood. How could a man like Allan, so composed and disciplined, descend into such darkness? How could a marriage that seemed so perfect conceal such devastating fractures? The answers lay in the journals, the footage, and the silent dining room where the Callaway family's final chapter had played out. For now, the community of Hawthorne could only wait as the investigation unfolded. The layers of this tragedy peeled back one by one. The questions were endless, the answers haunting, and the image of the Callaways, once so full of life, remained burned into the collective memory of those who dared to ask, how did it come to this? In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Hawthorne, Illinois, the Callaway family seemed to have it all. Their two-story home, adorned with flower beds and a white picket fence, was a picture of stability. Allan Callaway, a well-known corporate attorney, had built a reputation as a dedicated family man to anyone on the outside. He was the epitome of success, confident, composed, and caring. But beneath his polished exterior lay a man who constantly battled insecurities, particularly about whether he was doing enough for his wife and children. Elena Callaway had once been a rising star in the local art scene. Her paintings had hung in galleries across the state, and her talent was undeniable. But when Allan's career began to take off, she made the decision to step away from her art to support him and raise their children. At first it seemed like the right choice. Elena embraced her role as a mother to Matthew and Sophie, throwing herself into their lives with the same passion she once reserved for her craft. Yet as the years passed, she began to feel an ache she couldn't explain. The spark of creativity that once defined her had dimmed, replaced by the monotony of suburban routines. Matthew, their 14-year-old son, was the family's pride and joy. He excelled in academics and sports, often described as the perfect combination of discipline and talent. His younger sister Sophie, just 11, was a gifted pianist who filled the house with music. Together the siblings made their parents proud, their achievements painting the Callaways as the quintessential American family. But even in this idyllic household, small cracks had begun to form, cracks that would eventually deepen into an irreparable fracture in early 2010. Allan started to notice subtle changes in Elena. She began spending more time out of the house, claiming she needed to run errands or visit friends. Her once affectionate demeanor toward him grew distant. Allan, ever the rational thinker, convinced himself it was nothing to worry about. She was probably just adjusting to the demands of raising two growing children, he thought. But doubts began to creep in. He started paying closer attention to her routine teens, noticing how often her phone buzzed late at night, and how quickly she would put it away as the months went on. Allan's unease grew. By mid-2010. His suspicion turned into quiet paranoia. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, he picked up Elena's phone and scrolled through her messages. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The texts between Elena and someone named Ryan were casual at first, full of light-hearted conversations about art and gallery openings. But as Allan read further, the messages became more intimate. They spoke of shared moments that Allan hadn't been a part of late-night conversations that stretched long into the night. Allan didn't confront Elena immediately. Instead, he let his resentment simmer in silence. He began to obsess over the texts, replaying them in his mind. He analyzed her behavior, scrutinizing every glance, every sigh, every seemingly innocent comment. The trust that had once been the cornerstone of their marriage had been shattered, and Allan felt as though he were drowning in a sea of doubt. By late 2010, Allan's need for answers consumed him. He hired a private investigator to uncover the full extent of the affair. The reports confirmed what he had feared the most. Ryan Miller, a 42-year-old art dealer, was more than just a friend to Elena. The two had been meeting in secret for months. Ryan, with his charisma and shared love of art, had reignited a passion in Elena that Allan hadn't seen in years. The discovery cut Allan deeply. He began to question his own worth, wondering if his devotion to his work had left a void in their marriage that someone else had filled. As the year drew to a close, Allan retreated further into himself. By January 2011, he started documenting his thoughts in a journal. His entries were raw and unfiltered, a window into his unraveling mind. He wrote about his love for his children, Matthew and Sophie, and his fear that the truth about their mother's betrayal would one day taint their view of him. "They will grow to resent me," he scribbled in one entry. "Not for what I've done, but for what I couldn't prevent." He was haunted by the idea that his family was slipping through his fingers, that the foundation he had worked so hard to build was crumbling beneath him. In March 2011, Allan reached his breaking point. One evening after the children were asleep, he confronted Elena. The conversation was tense, filled with accusations and denials. Elena tried to deflect, at first claiming Allan was overreacting, but as he presented the evidence, a copy of the private investigator's report, the text messages he had found, she could no longer deny it. She admitted to the affair, but insisted it had been a mistake. Something she deeply regretted. She promised to end things with Ryan, swearing that she wanted to save their marriage, but for Allan it was too late. The damage had already been done. He couldn't unsee the betrayal, couldn't silence the voice in his head that told him their marriage was beyond repair. He began to withdraw. From Elena, their conversations growing colder and more mechanical in his journal, he wrote of the emptiness that now filled their home, of how every interaction felt like a performance for the children's sake. Allan's mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions, anger, heartbreak, and an overwhelming sense of failure. He still loved Elena, but the woman he had married felt like a stranger, and as much as he tried to shield Matthew and Sophie from the tension, he feared they could sense the growing rift between their parents. The Callaway household, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a cold and silent battleground. The weeks that followed the confrontation were a blur of routine and pretense. Allan continued to go to work to attend Matthew's soccer games and Sophie's piano recital, but inside he felt like a hollow shell. Of himself, the life he had built, the family he had cherished, now seemed like a fragile illusion, one that could shatter at any moment. And in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, Allan began to contemplate the unthinkable. On the evening of April 12, 2011, the Callaway household was filled with the soft hum of activity. The dining table, usually reserved for weekend family meals, was elegantly set with Allan's favorite china, and a pristine white tablecloth candles flickered. In the dim light, their glow casting warm shadows on the walls for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of normalcy. Elena had even remarked on how thoughtful Allan was to organize such a dinner, and the children Matthew and Sophie were excited to have the family together in one place. It had been too long since they'd shared a meal like this, and that Allan moved through the evening with a calmness that surprised even him. He poured wine for himself and Elena, careful to measure each glass. Precisely for the children, sparkling apple ciders sat in delicate glasses, making them feel part of the celebration. Elena had noticed Allan's unusual warmth throughout the day. He smiled more, his tone was softer, and he had gone out of his way to talk about how much he appreciated her and the family. It felt like a man trying to make amends, to find a path back to what had been lost. As the family gathered around the table, laughter echoed briefly, the kind that had been absent for months. Matthew spoke about an upcoming soccer tournament, his enthusiasm filling the room. Sophie, ever the creative one, talked about her latest piano piece, one she hoped to perform in a school recital. Elena sipped her wine, smiling as she listened, though a small part of her remained guarded. She could sense something in Allan's demeanor that she couldn't quite place. There was a finality to the way he looked at her and the children, as if he were memorizing every detail. What no one realized was that this meal would be their last. The wine in Allan and Elena's glasses, as well as the cider for the children, had been laced with a potent, odorless poison. Allan had carefully chosen. He had spent weeks researching it, ensuring it would act. Swiftly and painlessly, he justified his actions in his mind as an act of mercy, a way to protect his family from the fallout of their fractured lives. To him, this dinner was not just a goodbye. It was a final act of control over a life he felt had spiraled beyond repair. By the time the meal ended, the poison had begun to take effect. Elena was the first to feel its effects, a sudden wave of dizziness that made her grip the edge of the table for support. Matthew's excited chatter slowed his, words slurring as his eyes fluttered shut. Sophie too slumped in her chair, her small hands resting limply on the tablecloth. Allan sat back watching as the scene unfolded, his face impassive in his mind. He was giving them peace, sparing them from the anguish he believed would consume them if they lived to see the truth of their families unravel. The house fell silent that night, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Allan remained at the table long after his family had passed, his hands folded neatly in his lap. It was as though he were saying a final prayer, though he no longer believed in absolution. Hours later, he carried each of them, Elena, Matthew, and Sophie, to their beds, laying them down as though they were merely sleeping. The act was deliberate, almost reverent. He tucked the blankets around their still bodies and kissed each one on the forehead, his tears silent as they slid down his face. The next day, April 13th, 2011, Allan withdrew to his study. He spent the hours writing, filling page after page with letters addressed to family members, friends, and even his lawyer. Each letter was methodical, detailing his plans for his estate, the reasons for his actions, and his attempt to explain the pain that had led him to this point. His handwriting was precise. His words chose with care. There was no room for ambiguity. Allan wanted those who read his letters to understand that in his mind, this was the only solution he left: instructions for his assets, to be donated to charity, a gesture he hoped would cleanse some of the guilt he carried in his journal. He wrote his final entry, a chilling summation of his descent. Love built this house, and love will end it. The words were underlined, each stroke of the pen deliberate, as a stark reminder of how quickly a life built on love, ambition, and dreams could collapse under the weight of betrayal, despair, and silence, even as the media moved on to the next scandal. The scars of the Callaway tragedy lingered. Hawthorne was no longer just a picturesque suburb. It had become the stage for a story of love turned to darkness, a community grappling with the realization that perfection is often just a fragile facade. And in the stillness of Allan's study, the echoes of his final words lingered, a chilling reminder of the cost of unresolved pain. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our daily updates, and you can check out another insane case. We have the case where a police captain murders his secretary to hide a secret. Be sure to check it out and let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.